The airport was alive with its usual symphony of hurried footsteps, muffled announcements, and the hum of suitcases rolling across tiled floors. Daniel Whitaker stood in line. His tall frame stooped slightly as he leaned on his cane. His grandson, Malik, clutched his hand, looking around wide-eyed at the bustling terminal. At 10 years old, Malik was brimming with energy and curiosity, a sharp contrast to his grandfather's measured pace and quiet demeanor. Daniel glanced at the long line ahead of them, his expression unreadable. He was used to waiting. A life spent in the military had taught him patience, and retirement hadn't dulled that skill. But the subtle glances from those around him, the faintly curious, sometimes wary looks, were a different matter. He noticed them, though he pretended not to. This wasn't the first time he'd felt out of place, even as a man who had once commanded thousands. "Grandpa, are we gonna be late?" Malik's voice broke through his thoughts, tugging gently at his hand. "No, son," Daniel replied, his tone calm and even. "We've got plenty of time ahead." A young couple laughed as they breezed through the priority line. An airline employee greeted them warmly, her smile wide and welcoming. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, leaning on his cane. He had no priority pass, no shortcuts, just the steady, unhurried path he always took. When they reached the counter, the agent barely glanced up. Her name tag read, Jessica, and her tone was clipped. "ID and boarding passes," she said, not looking up from her screen. Daniel handed over the documents, his movements deliberate. Jessica's sigh was barely audible but unmistakable. Malik noticed it too, his small hand tightening in his grandfather's. Daniel gave a slight squeeze in return, a silent reassurance. Jessica finally glanced up, her expression neutral but her impatience clear. "You're traveling together?" she asked, her gaze flickering briefly to Malik. "Yes," Daniel said. His voice was steady, low, carrying the weight of someone who had spoken through far greater challenges. "There's a weight limit on carry-ons," Jessica said, nodding toward Daniel's well-worn bag. "You'll need to check that." "It's within the limit," Daniel replied, keeping his tone even. Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing more. With a practiced efficiency, she printed the boarding passes and handed them over without another word. "Thank you," Daniel said. He didn't miss the way she avoided his eyes. He didn't linger on it either. As they walked toward the security checkpoint, Malik looked up at him. "Why was she so mean?" he asked quietly. Daniel paused, glancing down at his grandson. "Not everyone knows how to treat people kindly," he said after a moment. "But that's on them, not us." Malik nodded, though his small brow remained furrowed. Daniel felt a pang in his chest, not for himself, but for the boy. Malik was still young enough to expect fairness, to believe that people would treat one another with decency. Daniel knew the world wasn't so simple. At the security line, a uniformed officer waved them forward. Daniel placed his cane on the conveyor belt, then his shoes, his bag, his jacket. It was a slow process, his movements careful and deliberate. The people behind him shifted impatiently, their irritation evident in the way they jostled their belongings. "Hurry it up," the officer said, his tone brisk. Daniel met his eyes briefly, then turned back to his task. He didn't rush, he didn't explain. Malik followed his lead, placing his sneakers and backpack on the belt. They stepped through the metal detector, one after the other. As they collected their things, Daniel heard the murmurs behind him, the quiet comments that weren't meant to be heard but weren't quite whispered either. He didn't react, but Malik glanced back, his expression uncertain. Daniel placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Eyes forward, son," he said softly. They moved on, leaving the checkpoint behind. The terminal opened up before them, a sea of people rushing to their destinations. Daniel adjusted his grip on his cane, guiding Malik toward their gate. His steps were measured, his gaze steady, but something about the air around him felt heavy, as if the simple act of traveling carried a weight beyond the physical. This was the part of life Daniel had never spoken of to Malik, the quiet indignities, the unspoken judgments. He had learned to carry them with the same quiet strength he carried everything else. But as he glanced down at Malik's young, open face, he wondered if his grandson would have to learn the same. He hoped, perhaps futilely, that things would be different by then. For now, they walked together, side by side, toward whatever lay ahead. The security line snaked through the terminal. A silent stream of travelers dutifully inching forward. Malik held tightly to Daniel's hand, his eyes darting around at the uniformed officers and imposing scanners. The boy's usual chatter had quieted, subdued by the sterile seriousness of the checkpoint. Daniel, however, moved with a calm precision. His cane tapped softly against the polished floor, his grip firm yet unhurried. He had been in countless lines like this before: military checkpoints, customs gates, even hospital corridors during more trying times. They all felt the same. Places where patience was both a virtue and a requirement. "Place your belongings in the bins," an officer called out, his voice firm but distant. As if on autopilot, the instruction was repeated often, though most people didn't need to be told. Daniel nodded toward Malik, guiding him to place his small backpack on the conveyor belt. The boy hesitated for a moment, then complied, glancing nervously at his grandfather. Daniel gave him a faint smile, a quiet assurance that there was nothing to worry about. The line moved forward, and Daniel began to remove his own items: a jacket, his well-worn wallet, a pair of reading glasses folded neatly into their case. His movements were deliberate, measured, as if each action was part of a well-rehearsed routine. He knew the pace of his hands wasn't fast enough for some. Though he didn't rush, he wouldn't let anyone else's impatience dictate his movements. "Sir, you need to remove your belt," an officer said sharply, stepping closer. Daniel glanced at him briefly, then nodded. He moved to comply, his hands steady as he worked the leather strap loose. The officer's tone wasn't hostile, but it carried a weight of expectation, an unspoken demand for efficiency. As Daniel placed his belt into the bin, he heard a muttered comment from someone behind him. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable, a mixture of annoyance and condescension. He didn't turn around. Decades of experience had taught him the futility of confronting such moments. Instead, he focused on Malik, who was watching him intently, as if taking notes on how to navigate the world. The boy stepped through the metal detector first, his small frame passing through without issue. The machine emitted a soft chime, signaling a clear scan. Malik turned back, waiting for Daniel, his expression a mix of relief and concern. Daniel followed, his cane steadying him as he stepped forward. The machine beeped, a sharp, mechanical sound that drew the attention of everyone nearby. "Step aside, sir," the officer said, gesturing toward a secondary screening area. His tone was practiced, professional, but there was a certain detachment in it, as if Daniel's presence was already an inconvenience. Daniel complied without a word, his face unreadable. He stood still as another officer began to wave a handheld scanner over him, the device beeping occasionally as it passed over the metal components of his cane and belt. Malik shifted uncomfortably nearby, watching the scene unfold. The boy's unease was palpable. Though he said nothing, Daniel could feel it, the way Malik's small hands fidgeted at his sides, the way his gaze darted between the officers and his grandfather. The scanner's beeping stopped, and the officer nodded, his expression neutral. "You're clear," he said, stepping back. Daniel retrieved his belongings without haste, carefully placing his belt back around his waist and his glasses back into his pocket. He straightened his jacket, the small rituals restoring a sense of order, a semblance of dignity. As they moved away from the checkpoint, Malik finally spoke, his voice quiet. "Grandpa, why did they stop you?" Daniel paused for a moment, glancing down at him. "Sometimes people stop you for reasons that don't make sense," he said evenly, "but that doesn't mean you have to let it bother you." Malik frowned, his young mind wrestling with the answer. It didn't seem fair. Daniel placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder, his grip gentle but firm. "Life isn't always fair, son, but how we respond to that is what matters." They continued walking, their steps falling into a steady rhythm. The terminal stretched out before them, a maze of gates and waiting areas filled with travelers of all kinds. Daniel's cane tapped softly against the floor, a quiet metronome in the midst of the airport's chaos. The moment at the checkpoint lingered in Daniel's mind, not because it was unique, but because it wasn't. It was part of a pattern. A series of small, almost imperceptible slights that had shaped his experience for as long as he could remember. He had learned to carry them with the same quiet strength he carried everything else. But that didn't make them any less heavy. As they approached their gate, Daniel glanced down at Malik. The boy's brow was still furrowed, his expression thoughtful. Daniel wondered what the world would teach him in the years to come. What lessons he would have to learn about patience, resilience, and the quiet weight of dignity. For now, Daniel resolved to teach him what he could, one moment at a time. The boarding gate was a study in controlled chaos. Passengers jostled in loosely formed lines, their voices overlapping in a low hum of conversation. A gate agent called out group numbers with a perfunctory tone, barely pausing between announcements. Daniel Whitaker and his grandson, Malik, waited quietly at the back of the queue. The boy tugged at the strap of his backpack, shifting on his feet, his energy barely contained. Daniel stood beside him, his cane resting lightly against his leg. He watched the scene before them with the same calm detachment he had at the security checkpoint. Years of experience had taught him not to expect much from moments like these. Group 3, please step forward, the agent announced, her voice clipped and efficient. The line inched forward. Malik glanced up at his grandfather. Are we Group 3, Grandpa? Daniel nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. That's us. They moved forward, Daniel's pace steady but unhurried. As they approached the desk, the gate agent barely looked up. Her name tag read, Emily Baxter. She was young, her movements brisk as she scanned boarding passes and waved passengers through without a word. When Daniel and Malik reached the counter, Emily's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Her gaze lingered on Daniel's cane, then moved quickly to Malik, as if appraising them. Boarding pass? She said, her tone neutral but distant. Daniel handed over the documents, his movements slow and deliberate. Emily scanned them, her brow furrowing slightly. You're in Group 3, she said, her voice carrying an edge of impatience. You need to move faster. The line's backing up. Daniel's expression remained unchanged. He met her eyes briefly, then nodded. We'll do our best. Emily sighed audibly, her frustration barely concealed. She handed back the boarding passes with a quick, almost dismissive motion. Gates that way. As Daniel and Malik moved toward the jet bridge, Malik glanced up at his grandfather. Why was she mad at us? He asked quietly. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He adjusted his grip on his cane, his steps measured. She's probably just having a bad day, he said after a moment. Malik frowned. She didn't seem mad at the people before us. Daniel paused, resting a hand on Malik's shoulder. Sometimes people treat others differently, even when they shouldn't, he said, his voice calm. But that doesn't mean we have to let it change how we act. They continued down the narrow jet bridge, the cool hum of the air conditioning brushing past them. Malik's small footsteps echoed beside Daniel's steady, deliberate stride. The boy seemed thoughtful, his usual chatter replaced by quiet contemplation. As they reached the plane, a flight attendant stood at the door, greeting passengers with a practiced smile. When she saw Daniel and Malik, her smile faltered slightly. She stepped aside without a word, motioning for them to continue down the aisle. Daniel's keen eyes didn't miss the subtle shift in her demeanor. It was a look he had seen countless times before unspoken, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It lingered in the air like a faint scent, a reminder of something unspoken yet understood. Malik climbed into his seat by the window, pressing his face to the glass as he marveled at the planes taxiing outside. Daniel settled beside him, his cane resting against his leg. He adjusted the small air vent above his seat, feeling the cool breeze on his face. Grandpa, Malik said after a while, his voice quiet, is it always like this? Daniel turned to look at him, his expression softening. Like what? Malik hesitated, his small hands fidgeting in his lap. Like the way people look at us, the way they act. Daniel leaned back in his seat, his gaze distant. He thought about the question, about how much a 10-year-old could understand, about how much he wanted him to understand. It happens sometimes, he said finally, but it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with us. It just means they don't know any better. Malik seemed to consider this, his brow furrowing slightly. But how do we make them know better? Daniel smiled faintly, a hint of pride in his eyes. By showing them who we are, he said, not with words, but with how we carry ourselves. With how we treat others. No matter how they treat us. Malik nodded slowly, his young mind turning over the words. Outside the window, the plane began to move, the engines humming softly as it taxied toward the runway. Daniel glanced around the cabin, noting the faces of the passengers nearby. Some were absorbed in their books or phones, others gazing out the window. Most paid no attention to him or Malik, but a few still glanced their way, their expressions fleeting but familiar. He didn't dwell on it. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, resting a hand on Malik's shoulder as the plane began to ascend. It wasn't the first time he had faced moments like this, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But for now, he was focused on the journey ahead, one step or one flight at a time. The hum of the terminal felt louder now, though Daniel wasn't sure if it was the crowd or simply the weight of the moment. Passengers moved around him in a steady stream, their voices blending into a low drone of background noise. Malik stood close by, his small hand clutching the strap of his backpack, his young face etched with confusion. Sir, you're being disruptive, the gate agent, Emily Baxter, said again, her voice firmer this time. She stood with her arms crossed, her stance defensive. Around her, a few passengers paused to watch, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Daniel met her gaze, his expression calm but resolute. I only asked for an explanation, he said, his voice steady. I don't believe I've done anything to warrant being denied boarding. Emily's lips tightened, she glanced at the small tablet in her hands, as though searching for justification. You raised your voice, she said, though her own tone was rising now. We have to prioritize the safety and comfort of all passengers. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He could feel Malik's eyes on him, the boys' confusion giving way to a quiet unease. Around them, the murmur of onlookers grew, the unspoken tension in the air thickening with each passing second. I see, Daniel said finally. He adjusted his stance slightly, leaning on his cane. And yet, I notice others have raised their voices here without consequence. Is there something specific about me that makes this different? Emily's face flushed. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside, she said, avoiding his question. Security will be here shortly to handle the situation. Daniel's jaw tightened, though his expression remained composed. He glanced down at Malik, who was now gripping his hand tightly. It's all right, Malik, he said softly. We'll sort this out. The boy nodded, though his young face betrayed his worry. Daniel could see the wheels turning in his mind, the questions forming that he was too polite or perhaps too scared to ask. He placed a reassuring hand on Malik's shoulder, steadying him. Within minutes, 2 security officers arrived, their presence drawing even more attention from the surrounding passengers. One of them, a tall man with a clipped manner, approached Daniel with an air of authority. What seems to be the problem here? He asked, his gaze flicking between Daniel and Emily. He was disruptive and refused to comply with staff instructions, Emily said quickly, her voice taking on a defensive edge. We can't allow him to board the plane. Daniel held his ground, his posture straight despite the weight of the moment. I asked for clarification, he said evenly. I believe that's a reasonable request. The officer frowned, his expression hard to read. He turned to Emily. Was there a safety concern? Emily hesitated, her confidence faltering for the first time. No, she admitted reluctantly. But he was slowing down the process. And we need to keep things moving. The officer's gaze shifted back to Daniel, lingering for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, his expression softened. Wait, he said, his brow furrowing as if in recognition. Are you, General Whitaker? Daniel inclined his head slightly, his calm demeanor unwavering. I am, he said simply. The officer stepped back, his stance shifting from one of authority to something more deferential. General, he glanced at Emily, his expression now tinged with embarrassment. I didn't realize. I served under your command in Kabul. Daniel nodded, though he didn't allow the recognition to shift his tone. I see, he said quietly. Then you understand why respect is important. No matter the circumstances. The officer straightened, his face reddening. Yes, sir. Of course. He turned to Emily, his voice firm now. This passenger will be boarding the flight. Is that clear? Emily opened her mouth as if to protest. But something in the officer's tone silenced her. She nodded stiffly, avoiding Daniel's gaze. The murmurs around them grew louder. Passengers whispering to one another as the scene unfolded. Daniel didn't acknowledge them. Instead, he turned to Malik, offering a faint smile. Looks like we'll make our flight after all, he said. Malik smiled hesitantly, the tension in his small frame easing slightly. Really, Grandpa? Really? Daniel said, his voice steady. He placed a hand on Malik's shoulder, guiding him toward the jet bridge. As they walked away, Daniel could feel the eyes of the crowd on them. The recognition, the whispers, the unspoken judgments, they were all familiar. But he didn't let them weigh him down. His focus was on Malik, on teaching the boy through his actions what it meant to carry oneself with dignity. Even in the face of quiet indignities. The officer at the gate watched them go, his expression a mix of regret and admiration. Daniel didn't look back. For now, the important thing was moving forward one step at a time. The silence on the plane was palpable as Daniel Whitaker and his grandson Malik stepped into the narrow aisle. Guided to their seats by the same flight attendant who had avoided eye contact earlier. The tension from the boarding gate seemed to follow them like an unseen shadow. Lingering in the cabin's air, Malik climbed into his window seat, placing his backpack on his lap as if it were a shield. Daniel settled beside him, his movements deliberate and calm. The low murmur of passengers around them felt sharper now, each whisper slicing through the quiet like a distant hum that refused to fade. He could feel the weight of their gazes, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. The flight attendant returned, her professional smile stretched thin. Can I get you settled with anything? She asked. Her voice tight, her tone more obligatory than welcoming. Daniel met her gaze, his face impassive. No, thank you, he said evenly. We're fine. Her nod was curt, and she quickly moved to the next row. Her relief almost palpable. Malik shifted in his seat, glancing at his grandfather. Why is everyone looking at us? Grandpa, he whispered. Daniel leaned closer, lowering his voice. Sometimes people don't know what to make of things they don't understand, he said, but it's not our job to explain ourselves to everyone. Malik nodded slowly, though his young face still held traces of uncertainty. He turned back to the window, staring out at the runway as the plane began to fill. Minutes later, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the safety instructions. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin, Daniel watched them with quiet observation. He noticed how they lingered longer with other passengers, their interactions more warm, more personal. When their eyes met his, there was always a flicker of something else, a hesitation, a guardedness that felt far too familiar. The plane began to taxi, the vibrations from the engines reverberating through the floor. Daniel leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes briefly as he let the steady hum ground him. But his moment of quiet was interrupted by a commotion a few rows ahead. A middle-aged man in a crisp business suit had called over a flight attendant, his voice louder than necessary. This is unacceptable, the man said, gesturing toward his seat. How can you let someone like that disrupt the boarding process and then just let it go? The flight attendant leaned in, speaking in hushed tones, but the man's voice rose again. I don't care what rank he had in the military. Rules are rules. The words hung in the air, a ripple of unease spreading through the cabin. Daniel opened his eyes, his expression unchanged. He had heard such comments before, their sharpness dulled only by repetition. But this time, Malik turned to him, his small face a mixture of confusion and hurt. Grandpa, is he talking about you? The boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel placed a steady hand on Malik's shoulder. Some people hold on to their own version of the story, he said softly, but it doesn't make it true. Malik didn't respond, but his gaze lingered on the man in the suit, who now seemed to relish the attention he had drawn. The flight attendant tried to calm him, her voice firm but polite, though it was clear she was walking a fine line. As the plane lifted off, the cabin gradually quieted, the tension settling into an uneasy equilibrium. Daniel turned to Malik, his voice low. Do you remember what I said about how we carry ourselves? Malik nodded. That it matters more than what people think of us. That's right, Daniel said. We don't let others define who we are. Malik's small shoulders straightened slightly. And he gave a faint nod. Daniel felt a flicker of pride. It was a small victory. But it was enough. The flight attendant passed by again. Her expression tight as she avoided looking in Daniel's direction. He didn't press her for acknowledgement or apologies. He had learned long ago that dignity often spoke louder than words. As the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, the cabin lights dimmed, and passengers settled into their seats. Malik rested his head against the window, his breathing slowing as he drifted into sleep. Daniel remained awake, his gaze fixed on the seat back in front of him. The man in the suit, now quiet, occasionally glanced over his shoulder, his disapproval still evident in his posture. Daniel noticed but didn't react. His focus was on Malik, on ensuring the boy's journey remained as steady as possible despite the turbulence around them. In the soft glow of the cabin lights, Daniel reflected on the events of the day. Each slight, each comment, each unspoken judgment, they were not new to him. But now, with Malik at his side, they carried a different weight. It was no longer just about enduring, it was about setting an example. About teaching the boy how to navigate a world that could be both beautiful and unkind. As the flight continued, Daniel rested his hand on Malik's small shoulder. The boy's warmth a quiet reminder of why he chose to rise above. It wasn't just for himself. It was for the next generation. For the possibility of a world that might one day see beyond the surface. For now, though, he stayed quiet, his strength found not in confrontation but in the steady, unyielding dignity that had carried him through so much already. The flight had landed, and the passengers shuffled into the terminal, their movements slow and deliberate after the confinement of the cabin. Daniel Whitaker waited patiently as Malik adjusted the straps of his backpack. The boy's energy, muted during the flight, returned in small bursts, his steps quick as they began the walk toward baggage claim. The airport was alive with its usual chaos, overlapping announcements, the hum of rolling suitcases, the murmur of travelers hurrying to their destinations. Malik clung to his grandfather's hand, his gaze darting around at the sea of unfamiliar faces. Daniel moved with a quiet purpose, his cane tapping softly against the polished floor. As they approached the exit, a uniformed officer intercepted them. His presence was commanding but not aggressive, his sharp eyes scanning Daniel and Malik with a practiced intensity. Sir, can I have a word with you? The officer said, his tone professional but edged with something unspoken. Daniel stopped, his expression calm. He was used to moments like this. Moments that seemed innocuous on the surface but carried a weight that others rarely noticed. Of course, he replied, his voice steady. Malik looked up at him, his young face creased with concern. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. It's all right, Malik. Stay close. The officer stepped aside, motioning for Daniel to follow. They moved to a quieter area near a row of empty chairs, away from the flow of passengers. Another officer joined them, his expression guarded. Is there an issue? Daniel asked, his tone measured. The first officer hesitated, glancing at his colleague before speaking. We received a report of a disturbance during boarding. We're just following up. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, though his demeanor remained composed. I see. And may I ask what the report said? The second officer cleared his throat. It was vague. Something about non-compliance. Daniel nodded, his gaze steady. I see. And what exactly is the concern now? Before either officer could respond, a third man approached a senior security officer, his polished badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His stride was purposeful, his face a mixture of authority and recognition. As he drew closer, his eyes locked onto Daniel's. General Whitaker, he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. Daniel inclined his head slightly, his posture straightening. That's correct. The senior officer stopped abruptly, his expression shifting. There was a flicker of something deeper: respect. Perhaps even admiration. I thought that was you, he said, his tone softening. I served under your command in Kandahar. For a moment, the bustling terminal seemed to fade into the background. The younger officers exchanged glances, their confusion evident as they watched the interaction. The senior officer extended his hand. Captain Adrian Walker, sir. It's an honor to see you again. Daniel took the offered hand, his grip firm but not overbearing. Captain Walker, he said, a faint smile touching his lips. It's been a long time. Walker nodded, his respect evident in the way he carried himself. Yes, sir. And if I may say, you saved a lot of lives back then. Mine included. Daniel's expression softened, but he didn't linger on the compliment. I was doing my job, Captain, as were you. Walker turned to the younger officers, his demeanor shifting into one of quiet authority. This man is a retired general. Whatever report you received was likely a misunderstanding. The officers stiffened, their earlier confidence replaced by an awkward deference. We didn't know, one of them said, his voice faltering. We were just following protocol. Walker nodded, his tone firm but not unkind. Understood. But let's ensure we handle situations like this with the respect they deserve. The officers mumbled their apologies before retreating, leaving Walker alone with Daniel and Malik. The captain's gaze lingered on the boy, his expression softening. This your grandson, sir? He asked. Daniel nodded. This is Malik. Walker crouched slightly, meeting Malik's eyes. You've got a good man looking out for you, he said gently. One of the best. Malik glanced at his grandfather, a flicker of pride lighting up his young face. I know, he said quietly. Walker straightened, turning back to Daniel. If there's anything I can do to make this right. Sir? Daniel shook his head. That won't be necessary, but I appreciate your intervention. Walker hesitated, then extended his hand again. It's good to see you, General, and thank you for everything. Daniel accepted the handshake with a nod. Take care, Captain. As Walker departed, Daniel turned to Malik, his expression thoughtful. Ready to go? Malik nodded eagerly, his earlier unease replaced with a quiet confidence. As they resumed their walk toward the exit, Daniel's steps remained steady, his cane tapping softly against the floor. He didn't dwell on the events of the day. They were part of a pattern he had long since learned to navigate. But as he glanced at Malik, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't just about enduring anymore. It was about teaching, about paving the way for a world where Malik wouldn't have to face the same quiet battles. For now, though, Daniel focused on the moment, on the small but significant victory of having carried himself with dignity, even when others had failed to do the same. The quiet buzz of the terminal followed Daniel and Malik as they made their way toward baggage claim. The earlier confrontation at the gate and the unexpected recognition from Captain Walker lingered like an unspoken weight. Daniel moved with his usual calm, but Malik's steps were quicker, his young energy returning as he glanced around the bustling airport. Grandpa, why did that man know you? Malik asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Daniel glanced down at his grandson. He served in the military. Like I did, he said simply. We worked together during some difficult times. Malik tilted his head, his curiosity piqued. Did you save his life? Daniel hesitated for a moment, his hand tightening slightly on his cane. It wasn't just me, he said. In situations like that, everyone works together to protect each other. It's never about one person. Malik seemed to consider this, his small brow furrowed. But he seemed really happy to see you. Daniel nodded. Sometimes people remember certain moments more than others, he said, and that's okay. What matters is how we carry those moments forward. As they reached the baggage carousel, Daniel noticed a group of passengers from their flight gathered nearby. Their quiet glances in his direction were impossible to miss. Some seemed curious, others uneasy, and a few offered polite nods when their eyes met his. Daniel acknowledged them with the faintest tilt of his head but said nothing. Malik tugged at his sleeve. Grandpa, they're looking at us again. Daniel crouched slightly to meet his grandson's gaze. Let them look, Malik, he said gently. It's not our job to explain ourselves to everyone. What's important is how we feel about who we are. Malik nodded slowly, his young mind absorbing the words. Okay, he said, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. The carousel began to turn, and luggage tumbled onto the conveyor belt. Daniel waited patiently, his cane resting against his leg as he scanned the sea of suitcases. Malik stood beside him, his small hands gripping the straps of his backpack. A woman nearby, middle-aged and well-dressed, stepped forward hesitantly. Her expression was conflicted, a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Excuse me," she said softly, addressing Daniel. He turned to her, his demeanor calm. "Yes? I overheard what happened back at the gate," she said, her voice faltering slightly, "and I wanted to say, I'm sorry, you didn't deserve that." Daniel studied her for a moment, his face unreadable. "Thank you," he said simply. The woman seemed to relax slightly at his response. I hope things like that don't happen often," she added, though her tone suggested she knew better. Daniel's gaze remained steady. "They happen," he said, "but what matters is how we respond to them." The woman nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Well, I just wanted to say something. I didn't want to stay silent." Daniel offered a faint smile. "Sometimes speaking up makes all the difference," he said. The woman seemed to take comfort in his words. She offered a small nod before stepping away, leaving Daniel and Malik alone once more. As the carousel continued to spin, Daniel finally spotted their suitcase, its worn edges a testament to years of travel. He retrieved it with ease, despite the slow deliberation of his movements. Malik reached for the handle, eager to help, and Daniel allowed him to pull the bag alongside his own backpack. They made their way toward the exit, the noise of the terminal fading behind them. Outside, the city stretched out under a gray sky, the streets alive with motion. Daniel paused for a moment, taking in the scene. Malik stood beside him, his small hand still clutching the suitcase handle. "Grandpa," Malik said, his voice quiet, "does it get easier?" Daniel looked down at him, his expression softening. "It depends on what you mean, Malik," he said. "Life doesn't always get easier. But we get stronger. We learn how to carry things differently." Malik nodded, though his young face remained thoughtful. "Like how you carry your cane?" he asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "Something like that," he said. "We carry what we need to, in the way that works best for us." As they stepped toward the curb to hail a cab, Daniel noticed a small group of people still lingering near the terminal entrance. Some were watching him, their expressions varying from curiosity to respect. He didn't let it bother him. His focus was on Malik, on teaching the boy how to navigate moments like these with the quiet strength he had learned over a lifetime. The cab pulled up, and Daniel guided Malik inside, settling the suitcase on the floor between them. As the city blurred past the window, Daniel allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The day had been challenging in ways both expected and unexpected, but it had also been an opportunity, a chance to teach Malik the lessons that truly mattered. For Daniel, that was enough. The small hotel lobby where Daniel and Malik waited was quiet, the soft murmur of other guests blending with the low hum of the air conditioning. Daniel sat on a cushioned chair, his cane resting against his knee, while Malik perched on the edge of his seat, his legs swinging idly. The morning's events seemed distant now, though their weight lingered in the back of Daniel's mind. A woman in a crisp suit entered the room, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She approached with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her name tag read, Cynthia Harper, Regional Manager. She extended a hand toward Daniel. "Mr. Whitaker," she began, her voice calm and practiced. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I understand there was an incident during your flight yesterday." Daniel rose slowly, shaking her hand. "Thank you for reaching out," he replied, his tone measured, "though I'd prefer to call it a misunderstanding." Cynthia's expression flickered briefly relief. "Perhaps." At his composed demeanor, "We at the airline take situations like this very seriously," she said. "I've reviewed the reports, and I want to assure you that we are committed to addressing the matter." Daniel nodded but said nothing. Malik glanced up at him, his young face a picture of curiosity. Cynthia continued, her hands clasped in front of her. "The employees involved have been placed on administrative leave while we conduct an investigation," she explained. We're also implementing additional training for our staff to ensure that situations like this don't happen again. Daniel's expression remained neutral. That's a start, he said quietly. But I hope this is about more than just procedures and policies. Cynthia hesitated. Of course, she said. We want to make things right. Daniel leaned slightly on his cane. His gaze steady. Making things right isn't about me, he said. It's about ensuring that people like my grandson, he gestured toward Malik, don't grow up believing they'll be judged before they're understood. Cynthia glanced at Malik, her expression softening. You're absolutely right, she said. We owe you an apology, Mr. Whitaker, and we'd like to offer compensation as a gesture of goodwill. Daniel shook his head, a faint smile touching his lips. I'm not interested in compensation, he said. What I want is progress. If this experience leads to real change, then it's worth far more than money. Cynthia seemed taken aback but nodded. Understood, she said. We'll do our best to honor that. As the conversation wound down, Malik tugged at Daniel's sleeve. Grandpa, he whispered, why don't you want the money? It could help. Daniel crouched slightly to meet Malik's gaze. Sometimes what we stand for is more important than what we're given, he said. If we can help others by asking for change instead of payment, that's what we should do. Malik nodded, his young face thoughtful. Okay, he said softly. Cynthia excused herself, leaving Daniel and Malik alone in the lobby. The boy leaned against his grandfather, his small hand resting on Daniel's arm. Grandpa, Malik asked after a moment, do you think they'll really change? Daniel's gaze drifted to the window, where the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street. I don't know, Malik, he admitted, but we can hope, and we can keep showing them what it means to do better. As they sat together, the quiet of the lobby felt almost comforting. A pause in the rhythm of the day. Daniel knew the challenges they faced weren't likely to ever fully disappear, but he also knew that moments like this, small and steady, were what laid the foundation for change. And for now, that was enough. The letter arrived the next morning, neatly folded in an embossed envelope bearing the airline's logo. Daniel sat at the small table in their hotel room, the morning light streaming through the window as Malik played quietly with his toy airplane on the bed. The boy's soft hums punctuated the silence as Daniel carefully opened the letter. Inside was a formal apology, written in polished corporate language. The words conveyed regret and promised action, improved training, policy reviews, and renewed commitment to diversity and inclusion. Attached was a voucher for a significant amount, a token of compensation for the inconvenience he and Malik had endured. Daniel read the letter twice, then set it aside, his expression contemplative. Malik looked up from his game, tilting his head. What's that, Grandpa? It's a letter from the airline, Daniel said, his tone even. They're saying they're sorry. Malik climbed off the bed, padding over to the table. He peered at the letter curiously. Are they giving us money? Daniel smiled faintly at his grandson's directness. In a way, yes, he said. They're offering something to make up for what happened. Malik's eyes widened. Are you gonna take it? Daniel leaned back in his chair, his cane resting against the table's edge. What do you think I should do, Malik? He asked, his voice calm. The boy hesitated, his small face scrunching in thought. I don't know, he admitted. If they're sorry, maybe that's good? Daniel nodded slowly. Saying sorry is good, he said, but sometimes it's not about what people give us. It's about what they learn. Malik frowned. What do you mean? Daniel gestured for Malik to sit beside him. The boy climbed into the chair, his legs swinging as he listened. When someone makes a mistake, Daniel said, giving something to fix it is easy. But real change comes when they understand why what they did was wrong and when they make sure it doesn't happen again. Malik nodded slowly. So, what are you gonna do? Daniel reached for his phone, his movements deliberate. I'm going to call them, he said, and I'm going to tell them what I think is more important than money. Malik watched intently as Daniel dialed the number on the letter. The call connected quickly, and a polite voice on the other end greeted him. Daniel's voice was calm, firm, as he explained his decision. I appreciate the gesture, he said, his tone steady, but I'm not accepting the compensation. Instead, I'd like to see the resources you would have used to compensate me go towards something that benefits all passengers, especially those who might face challenges like I did. The person on the other end seemed surprised. But they recovered quickly. Mr. Whitaker, we understand your concern. We'll make sure to bring this to our leadership team. Thank you, Daniel said, and I hope this experience leads to meaningful change. The call ended, and Daniel set the phone down. Malik looked at him, his young face filled with curiosity. Do you think they'll listen, Grandpa? Daniel rested a hand on Malik's shoulder, his gaze thoughtful. I don't know, he said honestly, but doing the right thing isn't about guarantees. It's about standing up for what you believe in, no matter the outcome. Malik nodded, his small shoulders straightening. I think you're right, he said quietly. Daniel smiled, a warmth spreading through him. Thank you, Malik, he said. That means a lot. As the day went on, the conversation lingered in Daniel's mind. The letter, the phone call, the quiet exchange with Malik, they were all part of a larger story. One that didn't end with a single apology or gesture. It was a story about change. About teaching the next generation to expect and demand better. Daniel knew the path forward wouldn't be easy. But as he watched Malik play, his toy airplane soaring through the air, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The boy's future was worth every quiet step, every calm but firm stand. For Daniel, that was enough. The airport felt different this time. The hum of travelers, the faint scent of coffee brewing at a nearby kiosk, the polished floors gleaming under fluorescent lights, it was all the same. Yet to Daniel Whitaker, there was a subtle shift. Like a melody played in a slightly different key. Malik walked beside him, his small hand wrapped around his grandfather's as they approached the check-in counter. The boy's steps were confident now, his earlier unease replaced by the quiet assurance of someone who had learned an important lesson. Daniel glanced down at him, a faint smile on his lips. Do you remember what I said about carrying ourselves with dignity? Daniel asked. Malik nodded, his young face serious. You said it's about how we act, no matter how other people treat us. That's right, Daniel said. And do you know why that matters? Malik tilted his head, thinking for a moment. Because it shows people who we really are. Daniel nodded. Exactly. When they reached the counter, the airline employee, a young man this time, greeted them with a polite smile. Good morning, sir. How can I help you today? Daniel handed over their tickets. The employee's smile remained, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes as he glanced at Daniel. Ah, Mr. Whitaker, welcome back. Let me get you checked in. The process was smooth, the employee courteous. Malik watched the interaction carefully, his bright eyes taking in every detail. Daniel thanked the young man, and they moved toward the security line. As they waited, Malik tugged on Daniel's sleeve. Grandpa, do you think that man knew what happened last time? Daniel's smile was faint, his gaze thoughtful. Maybe, he said, but that's not what's important. What is? Malik asked. What's important, Daniel said, is that he treated us with respect. That's what we want for everyone. Malik seemed to consider this, nodding slowly as they stepped through the security checkpoint. This time, the process was seamless. No impatient glances, no sharp words, just quiet professionalism. As they reached their gate, Daniel noticed a few passengers glancing in their direction. One woman smiled warmly, and Daniel returned the gesture. It wasn't the weighty, scrutinizing look he had grown accustomed to. It was something lighter, something closer to understanding. The same flight attendant from their previous journey was at the boarding gate. Her face paled slightly when she saw Daniel, but she quickly composed herself, offering a polite nod as she scanned their boarding passes. Welcome aboard, Mr. Whitaker, she said, her voice steady but tinged with something that might have been regret. Daniel met her gaze, his expression calm. Thank you, he said simply. As they walked down the jet bridge, Malik looked up at his grandfather. She remembered you, he said. Daniel nodded. I think she did. Do you think she feels bad about what happened? Maybe, Daniel said, but what matters is how she acts now. Malik nodded again, the wisdom of his grandfather's words settling over him like a blanket. They found their seats, Malik quickly claiming the window. As the plane began to taxi, He pressed his face against the glass, marveling at the sight of the runway stretching into the distance. Daniel settled into his seat, his cane resting at his side. He glanced around the cabin, noting the faces of the passengers and crew. Some were familiar, others new, but there was a quiet shift in the air, a feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, the ripples from their previous journey had reached farther than he expected. As the plane lifted off, Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. The steady hum of the engines a soothing rhythm. This wasn't just about a single flight or a single experience. It was about the small, quiet changes that accumulated over time, the kind that didn't make headlines but mattered deeply nonetheless. Malik leaned over, his voice soft. "Grandpa, do you think things will keep getting better?" Daniel opened his eyes, looking at his grandson. "I think so," he said, "as long as we keep trying." Malik smiled, his young face full of hope. "I'll keep trying," he said firmly. Daniel rested a hand on Malik's shoulder, his touch light but steady. "That's all I could ever ask, Malik." The plane soared higher, breaking through the clouds into the open sky. Daniel gazed out the window, the vast expanse stretching endlessly before them. It was a reminder that the journey was far from over, but for now, they were moving forward, and that was enough.